So hello, everybody. We're at our postgraduate symposium. It's June 20. God, I'm sorry, I've been in the hospital all week. It's June 2023, and we're very pleased and very happy to have Prof. Tina Beatie, or Prof. Tina, as she prefers to be called, to join us today. And she is going to be giving an amazing presentation about not just the way in which theology works in an academic perspective, but also in an emotional way, in an emotional atmosphere. I would like for Prof. Terry Sacco, our academic dean, our president, to introduce her and also talk about a future opening thing that we have going on. So please, Prof. Terry, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tina, for coming into our circle. It's wonderful to have you, and knowing that you bring a very special perspective, a feminist perspective, a social justice perspective, and a deep concern for the whole of creation. And that really resonates with our vision and our mission at St. Augustine, because with Jaco Kruger, Professor Jaco Kruger, who's our academic dean, we envisaging a integral ecological worldview that promotes peace. So it's very apposite that we have you here, and welcome to all our students and the Friends of St. Augustine. So while this is a postgraduate symposium, a lot of our friends are here. And I'd just like to also welcome Hilary from Australia. He is here having dinner with me and Mark James, who's one of the editors of the book that is being launched on Saturday, on the 1st of July at the Woodmead Catholic Church. And we are very pleased that in 8 months, the publisher, Hilary, and the editors have got the book together with 70 contributors. I think that's a first for me to witness. So you're very welcome, and thank you for being with us this evening. And I see that there are also old students that are here, alumni and lecturers that go back a very long way. So you are all close to our hearts. So thank you for being with us. Just to introduce Tina, she was the professor of Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton in London until 2020. She is now an independent researcher and author, and she has published widely on issues of sacramental theology, art, gender, and social justice. Currently, she's developing a range of online courses for FIDE, which is Faith and Dialogue Encounter Institute, and this was formerly the Catherine of Siena College. She regularly contributes to British and international media. So it's beautiful to have you in our academic spaces, Tina, but also that you've got very profound roots in Africa. Tina was born and grew up in Lusaka, Zambia, and has also lived in Kenya and Zimbabwe. She still has close links to African theologians. And her novel, Between Two Rivers, which was published in 2022, and it was set in Rhodesia during the end of colonialism and the War of Liberation. She now lives in the south coast of England with her husband, and they are deeply blessed with 4 adult offspring and 4 grandchildren. So welcome, Tina. We're delighted you are with us.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen and attempt to get my PowerPoint presentation up. Here we go. So I just need to go down here and tell it to play from start. I hope, can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
Yes, great. So I just can't say how delighted I am to be with you tonight. I wish I were with you in person, but this is second best. And please just say if you have any problems seeing or hearing, because I can only see my PowerPoint presentation now, so I can't see if anybody's gesturing or anything in the background. But so just thank you for this invitation, and here we go. I thought you've heard who I am, and what I'm talking to this evening is my current research, which is for a monograph I'm writing, focusing primarily on Pope Francis's Laudato Si, his 2015 encyclical on the environment, which has had a huge impact, I think, on much wider than the Catholic community. It's a wonderful vision of care for creation, our common home. And one of the things I love engaging with Pope Francis is his style. He is developing a poetic, lyrical, mystical style. And this is underwritten by profound philosophical and theological study. Some say, oh, he's a bit of a lightweight, but actually he doesn't boast. He doesn't show off his learning because he wants to communicate. And that means setting aside this huge depth of knowledge to use language that makes it a pleasure to read him and that arouses our emotions and our responses, as I think we need to do when we talk about the environment. So for the book I'm working on, I'm trying to develop a dialogical style that follows Pope Francis's model for good dialogue, and I'll say something about that later. But that also involves being willing to say, hold on a minute, there are some problems here. So this is not just a hagiographical account of how wonderful Pope Francis is, but it's very much indebted to a Pope who I really do think is a wise Pope and a beautiful person. And thank God for the leadership that he is offering us. So I thought I would, and my images for this are from a work of art called the Case Karma Altarpiece, which I'm going to talk about at the end of my talk. Explaining the title of my talk tonight, it comes from a quotation from Joseph Piper, who's quoting Heraclitus, that we need to listen to the essence of things. And I'm going to explore this evening what I think that might mean in terms of silence, language, dialogue, silencing, which is not silence, that's a violation of the right to speak and be heard, and then concluding by trying to show visually some of what I've been talking about through 3 different works of art. And funnily enough, this morning, I looked at the Office of Readings for the day, and it was from Irenaeus Against Heresies. And here is the last little bit of the reading. If the revelation of God through creation gives life to all who live upon the earth, much more does the manifestation of the Father through the Word give life to those who see God. And I was preoccupied by this, particularly in light of speaking tonight. I'm doing this the old-fashioned as well as the virtual way. I've printed off my notes because I can't see them on my screen, which is why I'm looking aside to read. But I found myself thinking, what does this mean about creation, the relationship of all life forms to God, and the particular relationship it suggests that Christians, followers of Christ, have to God? So if the revelation of God through creation gives life to all who live upon the earth, I think that means all living creatures, that God gives life to all that is. Much more does the manifestation of the Father through the Word give life to those who see God. Now, this suggests to me that to have a relationship with the Word, with Christ, is to see God not just as creator, but as Father. I'm not doing a completely feminist talk tonight, so I'm not going to deconstruct the language of fatherhood. I think it does far more heavy lifting than the Church has realized, because every human father who bases his masculinity and fatherhood on patriarchal models of what that means has not really paid attention to what Scripture says about fatherhood. as seen in Jesus Christ, but that's not a path I'm going to go down tonight. But to see the Father through the Word is to have a personal relationship with the Creator. But I was also thinking that this is not a privileged, exclusive term, the way it sometimes seems to function among Christians. And I thought of salt of the earth and light of the world, that our call is to flavor creation and to illuminate it so that people see more deeply and taste more sensuously what everybody already sees and experiences through being alive in God's creation. And that sort of gave me a way into what I want to say tonight. How do we cultivate that sense of taste and see that the Lord is good through our relationship with creation? So I've divided my talk this evening up into various sections, and some of them I'll just skim over in order to allow time for discussion. Being and belonging, silence and beholding, encountering and communicating, silencing and violating, and then I talk about tradition, incarnation, and enculturation by looking at some works of art. And as I say, this is primarily ideas inspired by Pope Francis's writings. So, being and belonging, and I thought of the term Ubuntu, about which I'll say a little bit more, but I want to consider the challenges we face today in terms of our capacity to have a sense of being and belonging in relation to one another and in relation to creation, because it seems to me we need to completely almost begin again in understanding what this means in our harsh and violated world, where we are so positioned by destructive ideologies of individualism, globalization, and all the challenges that Pope Francis poses to our modern world order in terms of what he calls technocracy, anthropomorphism, and an exclusive and excessive focus on the human at the expense of other life forms and aspects of creation, what he calls rapidification, the intense speed of our modern way of life. And I heard a lovely story from someone who helped him to draft Laudato Si, that translators went to him and said the word rapidification does not exist in any language. And he said, I don't care what else you change, but you're not getting rid of that word. So rapidification, the kind of helter-skelter pace of modern life, and all the social and economic injustices that flow from this. And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis calls for an anthropological transformation. So I want to consider what are the challenges we face in that context and what resources do we have. So he says in Laudato Si that, I'm using a lot of PowerPoint slides because I think with this kind of online presentation, there's a risk of just a talking head. And I'd rather you were able to see what I'm saying. I wouldn't in a live presentation use quite so many slides, death by PowerPoint and all that. So, but Pope Francis says an inadequate presentation of Christian anthropology gave rise to a wrong understanding of the relationship between human beings and the world. Often what was handed on was a Promethean vision of mastery over the world, which gave the impression that the protection of nature was something that only the faint-hearted care about. Now, when I read that, I found myself thinking back to another Vatican document, and that is the 1968 encyclical Populorum Progressio, which in many ways shares the same concerns about social and economic justice that Laudato Si expresses. But let's look at the anthropology of Populorum Progressio. Endowed with intellect and free will, each man is responsible for his self-fulfillment, even as he is for his salvation. He is helped and sometimes hindered by his teachers and those around him. Yet whatever the outside influences exerted on him, he is the chief architect of his own success or failure. Utilizing only his talent and willpower, each man can grow in humanity, enhance his personal worth, and perfect himself. Now, if we complained about exclusive language, we would be told this is inclusive. Man embraces woman in this kind of context, and this refers to humankind. But actually, this is not inclusive. It's not only androcentric, it is guilty of that sort of anthropocentric power game that I think Pope Francis is criticizing. I don't need to tell people in Africa what a false understanding this is of our capacity to be self-made men. We are so dependent on so many other factors in order to develop ourselves and fulfill our potential. This idea that we can use only our talent and willpower militates against any concern for those who will live and die in poverty, without education, often because of gender issues. Women and girls are more likely to be deprived of these opportunities than successful men. But everyone who is on the wrong side of history as it's written is going to know that it takes far more than talent and willpower to achieve all that every human is capable of achieving. The African saying, it takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a whole community to allow every individual to be all that they are able to be. And it takes a more just global community than we have now. So we can see that there has been a huge development in the anthropology of Catholic social teaching and Catholic theology, in terms of the difference between these two encyclicals. One of them is geopolitical. It says nothing about creation. It very much sees nature in terms of the sort of functional terms of what human beings need to prosper and to grow and to develop. And in Laudato Si, we have not a geopolitical, but a biopolitical vision of creation. It sees us not in terms of nations and borders and resources, but in terms of relationships and interdependencies and webs of life. Now, one of the sources I've been engaging with recently is a South African psychoanalyst, Sally Weintraub, who now lives in Britain. And she talks about a culture of exceptionalism in the Western world since the rise of modernity. And by that, she means that we Westerners are highly inventive in justifying why each of us should be exempt from the rules that we think should apply to everybody else, particularly with regard to changing our politics and lifestyles to protect the environment. So we hear a great deal, and this really strikes me as an African born and raised person now living in Britain. There is a tendency to interpret the rest of the world in terms of we tolerate you, or we have something to teach you, never in terms of we have something to learn from you and you have something to give to us, unless, of course, what you're offering can be attributed to some indigenous Native American culture, in which case we have lots of nice, warm, fuzzy slogans that we can use that surely some ancient Native American Indian once said, and if they didn't, we'll say they did. But actually, the nitty-gritty of learning from other living cultures is not something that we do very well in the West. Now, Sally Weintraub talks about neoliberal exceptions, that neoliberalism thrives in what she calls a culture of uncare. And one of the problems with this is that sadness is nipped in the bud, she says, before it can ripen into the grief that's a necessary catalyst for change. She says care is under attack here, as to feel grief about the state of our world is to care about it. I think that's one of the missing dimensions of the environmental movement, and it's very much part of Pope Francis's vision. We can feel rage, we can feel guilt, we can feel all sorts of things, but sometimes we just have to mourn for what has been lost and will not be recovered. I live very near the beach here and I swim in the sea all year round, which I love. But I'm very aware that had I come to the speech 50 years ago, there would have been much more variety of marine life, of shells, of everything else than there is today. So grief is appropriate. And Weintraub, and for me, argues that economic and political transformation is as much a task of psychology as policy. She cites Bertrand Russell, who said that most current discussions of politics take insufficient account of psychology. And that's very much the focus of my own research. I've done research through a psychoanalytic lens for many years, particularly Lacanian psychoanalysis and Lacan's feminist interpreters like Luce Irigaray, Ellen Sixu, Julia Kristeva. But I don't do this by sort of reading theology into psychoanalysis, but by asking how psychoanalytic readings can help us to understand some of the dynamics of theological language. And Weintraub traces the modern realization that the world is in crisis back to the 1980s. And she says, the task of growing up involved mourning illusory, exaggerated entitlement, not easy, especially after 400 years of colonialism and industrialization. Exaggerated entitlement was deeply embedded in Western culture and supported by philosophical and religious ideas of men holding dominion. And I think we see that in that quote from Populorum Progressio. And there's a task of mourning, she suggests, associated with letting go of those power games. I had a little Twitter spat with a very famous British theologian this week because he talked about the soft power of the British Empire. And I said, you know, I grew up in colonial and post-colonial days, and I don't recognize soft power. I see only racism and the violent appropriation of other people's lands, histories, and stories. So he didn't agree, but I don't think he's ever actually lived there long enough to realize. Anyway, I won't go on about that. But what interests me is that if we push through this modernity and this idea of an abstract culture, an exploitative culture, and go back to our medieval theological roots, there's deep resonance with a lot of psychoanalytic insights about the nature of desire and its distortions. And in fact, very interestingly, French psychoanalysts, including Jacques Lacan and a lot of French critical theorists, did study medieval theology for their PhDs. So there's a kind of strand of medieval thought that informs some modern psychoanalytic approaches to questions of desire and psychology. And particularly, I think this brings us to questions of virtue, the disciplining of desire, not in terms of punitive regimes of self-control, but in terms of learning to be in creation with the genius of being human. You know, if I want to learn to play a musical instrument, I have to be disciplined in order to be free. We have to actually practice something in order to be free to do it very well and to gain the pleasure of doing that. And life is like that. We have to become disciplined practitioners of living well in order to freely live well. That's virtue ethics, and that's also something of what I'm seeking for when I talk about desire and its distortions and our relationships to creation. So with all that in mind, I'm talking about Western culture, but what about African cultures? Now, as we all know, Ubuntu is often cited as a rich resource that African theology and culture can offer to Western thinkers. And I've just summarized here Julius Gatogo's summary of John Mbiti's originating influence on the idea of Ubuntu. And I'm going to come back to this, particularly in Beatie's idea of oral, written, and symbolic theology when I get towards the end of my paper. As you probably know, Beatie has been criticized for too much of a focus on culture and not enough of a focus on liberation. But Gatogo points out that Africa's Ubuntu theology builds on relational theology, which necessitates a deeper dialogue between people's experiences and indigenous resources of the African peoples as the hallmark of authentic Christian faith in Africa. And it points to the importance of hospitality, human and divine, the humanity of others, and the theosocial diversity of others as God's plan for the world. So Ubuntu theology is dialogical, inclusive, community-driven, humane, just, and methodological, contextual, and reconstructive. Now, this has a great deal to offer in this quest to go beyond Western individualism with its exploitative and uncaring culture towards a more relational understanding of being and belonging in the world, such as we find in Laudato Si. But I will mention Emmanuel Katangoli later, his Sacrifice of Africa, which is a wonderful work. But as he so wisely points out, we risk idealizing African culture if we just say Ubuntu is just this answer that we can take from Africa, without acknowledging that African communities face the same challenges that we all face in different ways from globalization. So here I've taken from an essay by Laurentii Magesa saying, amid the multiple social and religious identities that confront us and claim our allegiance in this politically and economically multipolar and polycentric, but nonetheless intimately interconnected universe, who we really are is a question whose answer is by no means straightforward. In Africa, there are few, if any, who in one way or another do not feel overwhelmed by it. Globalization has taken our innocence away, and like everyone else, Africa stands naked to the world. It's an amazing expression. And I suspect every one of us feels that individually and in our communities, if we care, if we're not profiteering from the greed and oblivion of some of our Western leaders at the moment and some African leaders. We feel naked before the world. We feel we've lost our innocence, and we don't know how we can reclaim or rediscover what it means to be and belong within creation. So I'm going to now look at the next part of my talk, which is silence and beholding. And I'm going to suggest that we need to find our way back beyond the language we use to a new way of being in and therefore speaking about the world. We can't begin with silence. In the beginning was the word. We are born into a creation that speaks and into a species that communicates. And so when we seek silence, we are doing what Simone Weil sometimes calls decreation. We're seeking to go back through contemplation, through rest, through just being instead of doing, to a primal state of understanding where new worlds can emerge through new words. Heidegger says we inhabit the house of language. And if we're going to change our way of inhabiting our common home, the earth, I believe we also have to change the architecture of the house of language that we inhabit. So Pope Francis talks about the universe unfolding in God, who fills it completely, and the mystical meaning to be found in a leaf, in a mountain trail, in a dewdrop, in a poor person's face. The ideal is not only to pass from the exterior to the interior, but to discover God in all things. And that calls for deep attentiveness, whether I am looking at a leaf in the sunset or the face of another human being. I have to ask, who art thou? What are thou suffering? What are you suffering? Who are you? And I have to be attentive to that shimmer of grace by which God sustains in being all that is. There's a lovely passage in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia, which I haven't got it to hand, but it's something like, it's almost what it means is if God blinked for an instant, creation would fall back into non-existence. That the act of creation is not once upon a time in the book of Genesis. It is the minute by minute by minute microcosmic upholding of being in being. And I would suggest that the story of Genesis is played out throughout that. It's a kind of multi-layered synchronicity of being created, being tempted, falling, being redeemed, walking out into the wilderness, seeking the companionship of God along the way. And this brings me back to Joseph Piper's wonderful book on leisure, the basis of culture, where he argues that, and this book was written, by the way, not long after the end of the Second World War, there is a wonderful treasure trove of writers by Catholic philosophers and thinkers written in the trauma of Europe towards the end and after the end of the Second World War, which I think offers much wisdom for our time. And Piper talks about leisure as being a form of silence which allows us to apprehend reality. Only the silent hear, and those who do not remain silent do not hear. Leisure is a receptive attitude of mind, a contemplative attitude, and it's the capacity for steeping oneself in the whole of creation. Now, there's a book by an Anglican hermit called Maggie Ross, where she talks about the idea of beholding. And I'm just finding my notes on what she says. Maggie Ross argues that in the Bible, the word for behold occurs hundreds of times in the Greek and many times in the New Testament, in the Greek of the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the Greek and the Hebrew of the Old Testament. And she argues that this is translated as see or look. It hardly appears in modern translations of the Bible, but she makes the point that beholding means much more than seeing. It means a form of attentive, we might think of looking with the heart or looking with the third eye. It's a way of seeing into the substance of things, into the essence of things. So with that, I'm moving on to encountering and communicating, because it seems to me that unless we have had that silent attentiveness, that standing before the face of the other, whether that's another species, another natural phenomenon, or another human being, until we have allowed ourselves to have that silence that's almost kenotic. This is not me for now. I'm listening to you. But then I have to come onto the scene, because no dialogue is possible without two who have their place in the world and know who they are. So, sometimes when we talk about, for example, interreligious dialogue, and people say, we're all the same. No dialogue can happen if we're all the same. Dialogue can only happen if we can affirm difference as good and recognize the kind of difference that enhances our being and the kind of difference that divides. So encountering and communicating, again, using Pope Francis's language, he talks about soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. And British environmentalist Mary Colwell talks about the language of Laudato Si. She says, love, affection, God, caress. 4 words I have never heard in any environmental meeting. Please, please, environmental world, can you only use words that are used in poems? Because actually, love of the earth is all about love. It's all about our emotional response to what's around us, to what we're part of. So I spoke about silence as a way of rebuilding the house of language. And I think in Pope Francis, if we compare his language with that of some of his predecessors, we do see a shift from the abstract and the dogmatic to the lyrical and the affective. And I'm suggesting that rebuilding the house of language is a quest for a language of relationality and care. And it's a language of dialogue. And these are Pope Francis's recommendations for good dialogue. Excuse me. Now, this comes from Amoris Laetitia, and here dialogue is in the context of marriage. But I think we can use this recipe for dialogue in any kind of dialogue, intercultural, interfaith, in communities, in personal relationships. It's the fruit of a long and demanding apprenticeship. It takes time, patience, and attentiveness. Again, cultivating an interior silence. Until we can master that interior silence, we're not able to really enter into dialogue because we don't know ourselves. And if I don't know myself, I can't know others. To love my neighbour as myself is actually a challenging task, because to love myself as my neighbour means that I must also be self-critical, but in a spirit of wanting the best for myself as I would want for the neighbour I love. We have to give real importance to the other person, keep an open mind, and seek a reconciled diversity. Don't patronise, and choose your words carefully. It's not about winning an argument or being proved right. And he says, don't be boring, which is, of course, also, as well as that interior silence, cultivate an interior richness. Have something that's worth saying before we speak. And in Querida Amazonia, I find this very interesting in terms of dialogue. It must not only favour the preferential option on behalf of the poor, the marginalised and the excluded, but also respect them as having a leading role to play. Others must be acknowledged and esteemed precisely as others, each with his or her own feelings, choices and ways of living and working. Otherwise, the result would be a plan drawn up by the few, for the few, if not a consensus on paper or a transient peace for a contented minority. That's huge ideas packed in there. But for me, particularly where I'm speaking in an African context, that means that we in the West must not speak for the global South. So often as a theologian with an African background, I find myself thinking, why am I dabbling around in psychoanalysis? Should I be doing African theology? No, I shouldn't. African theologians and African thinkers are well able to speak for themselves about Africa. The problem is, believe me, most in the West aren't listening. And if we are listening, we're jumping ship. We're saying, oh, well, African theology is nicer to engage with than European theology, so let me become an African theologian. No, the challenge is to say, how do we speak from where we are and listen to each other so that we are sharing our wisdom, our problems, our challenges? And this is part of what dialogue must surely mean. I'm going to skip this actually because it's just about the particularity. And Emmanuel Katangoli, he talks about stories. The stories we tell shape who we are. So a lot of what I'm saying is, how do we tell a better story about ourselves? And for that story to be truthful, it has to be not just about what's good and rich and positive, but also what's difficult and challenging, where we fail, where we don't live up to the stories we'd like to tell. And Katangoli talks about the stories of Africa, so that Africa becomes an idea. Every word we use in a story becomes an idea. And in rebuilding this house of language, how do we rebuild the idea of ourselves as creatures of God's good creation, each with a particular part of this earth that we're given to care for, whether it's a tiny plot of land or a home or a community or a country. This is what we've been given, and this is our call to care for it through the way we relate and speak and reflect. But I come now to a different kind of silence, the silence of violation. Now, again, I don't need to tell African theologians and scholars what I mean by this. To colonize another, whether we colonize that person's body, that person's share of creation, that person's history and voice, when we impose silence on another, that is very different from the kind of silence that creates this interior attentiveness. It's a silence that robs people of their identities, their histories, their sense of becoming. And this, of course, is what colonialism did to the people of Africa. But I want to focus here on what I see as another kind of silencing. And here is where I'm critical of Pope Francis. He says a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Now, for a start, I don't like this term, the cry of the poor, because it suggests that the poor is this kind of blob that sits among us, needy, homogenous. The poor, again, I don't need to tell people listening in Africa, are as diverse. I think they're more diverse than the rich, actually. There is nothing so homogenous as wealth. I look at our British government today, and if you look only at skin colour, yeah, great, it's diverse. But actually, they are signed up to the homogeneity of greed and corruption. And when you sign up to that homogeneity, your diversity does not count for anything. They are all the same. So maybe we need to look to those who are poor to rediscover our diversity, our different ways of coping with and meeting the challenges of life. Michel de Certeau, who, by the way, is a major influence on Pope Francis's style and his theology. But Michel de Certeau talks about bricolage as the ways in which, when we live in bureaucratic systems that would reduce us all to cogs in a great machine, we each find ways of wriggling around the system, and we each find ways of expressing our individuality. And in my experience, I remember visiting Kibera in Nairobi a few years ago with a CAFOD group, and just being struck by how in that poorest of slums, the diversity of human life, the entrepreneurial spirit, the survival was truly amazing, truly amazing. So I don't like to speak about the poor, but I do want to say that Pope Francis violates his own wisdom when he writes about gender in Laudato Si. Now, some people might say Laudato Si isn't about gender. It is one of the most gendered documents I have ever read, and yet it only mentions women in passing, but it opens with a reference to St. Francis, who reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life, and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. This sister now cries out to us because the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the sickness, the earth's sickness, basically. And then he says, this is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. Do you know, I might be wrong, but I think that is the only reference in Catholic social teaching to the fact that childbirth is blinking hard work. And for many women, it's deadly. But you will not find official church teaching documents acknowledging that women groan and often die in the travail of childbirth. Here it's quoted in terms of our sister, the earth. Now, the problem with this is that my feeling when I read Laudato Si is that Pope Francis is writing about men to men. And he is saying men have become this image of these powerful, technocratic, anthropocentric masters of nature, and now men need to become chivalrous rescuers of Mother Earth. And playing into this is a gender politics that's deeply damaging to our understanding of nature and our understanding of women and girls. Carolyn Merchant writes about the death of nature and about how, with the rise of the late Middle Ages and the Reformation and modernity, the understanding of nature changed from a benevolent and nurturing mother who had to be respected. So, for example, before the European nations started their expansionism and began to be interested in mining, there was a belief that mining was really ethically very dubious because it was like raping the body of Mother Earth. So there was a sense of this maternal body being an awesome power that had to be respected. And Merchant writes that symbolically associated with unruly nature was the dark side of woman. So woman here either becomes the soft, romantic, feminine genius, maternal nurturer, or she becomes the sexually dangerous temptress, the bringer of death. We might think of Mary and Eve. I can't go into that here. But she says, like wild, chaotic nature, woman needed to be subdued and kept in their place. Now, let's think about that. What is Catholic teaching about women all about, really? Isn't so much of it about subduing us and keeping us in our place, particularly around our fertility and sexual capacities? There is so much energy expended on making women into these rather kind of romantic ideas of fertile Mother Nature, and that plays out in Laudato Si. And what that prevents us from seeing in our ecology and in our gender politics is that women are not lying in a ditch as helpless victims. Mother Earth is not waiting for us to change. Mother Earth will destroy us if we're not careful. She's not going to lie around saying, where are these men Pope Francis wants to come and help me? And similarly, women don't do that. Women don't wait for men to become kinder and nicer. We have two really awful stories in the British media at the moment. One is of a woman who discovered she was pregnant by a lover before lockdown, and during lockdown had to move back in with her husband and the father of her 3 children, and was so terrified of him finding out about her pregnancy that she obtained abortion pills and took them. But by that time she was very advanced in pregnancy, and she gave birth to a stillborn daughter who was by then 32 weeks, so viable, and she has now been sent to prison for 3 years, of which half she will serve in community. But her children have been deprived of their mother. And this week, a woman who gave birth when she was 15, clearly a very disturbed girl. She'd been having sex with men to give her a sense of self-esteem. She hadn't used a condom because her boyfriend didn't want to. She gave birth at 15 in her parents' house while they were upstairs in silence, and she killed the baby. And she's been sentenced to 12 years in prison for murder. Of course, the father of the baby has not been named or shamed or implicated. My point is that these are horrific stories, but they militate against the representation of maternal life offered by church teaching. And life can be brutal and harsh. And for women, particularly in terms of childbirth. Now, this is 2018 statistics, and just look at across sub-Saharan Africa, as many of you know, childbearing can be a death sentence for women and the unborn children they bear. I was giving a talk in Nairobi a few years ago, and I asked the people in the room to put their hands up if any of them had a close relative, a close female relative who had died in childbirth. Every hand in the room went up. 100 years ago, that would have been true in an audience in this country. It's not true now because poverty is a major killer of mothers. But when women face death, injury, fistulas on a grand scale, then they do not always sit around as helpless victims waiting for it to happen. So my argument is that ecology and gender politics go hand in hand. If we can't relate to women in our church teaching as human beings with agency, with dignity, with equality, we're not going to be able to relate to Mother Earth in ways that will allow for a robust and proper ecology. And also the startling thing about Laudato Si, as a dialogue which is clearly intended to be with all humankind, is that gender equality and the role of women is absolutely central to the Sustainable Development Goals. So how was it possible for Pope Francis to write a whole encyclical on the environment while ignoring this central plank of the international community's commitment to sustainable development? So I raise these challenges and questions here. I don't have answers, but I think we need to say that Laudato Si is lacking at both the level of ecology and gender politics, because neither Mother Earth nor women feature in ways that they need to feature if we are to be realistic about the challenges we face in terms of social justice and in terms of the environment. Right, I want to allow time for questions, and I'm going to close by looking at some pictures, because I'm talking about sacramentality. I'm talking from within the Catholic tradition about how we can go back into a kind of silence that is attentiveness, that is awareness. And out of that silence, rebuild the house of language. And in doing that, it's vital that we hold together tradition and change, and that we cultivate a sacramental understanding of creation that recognizes, as Pope Francis says in all his writings, but particularly in Evangelii Gaudium, that Christ is incarnate in history and in cultures. In every culture that receives the gospel and makes it its own, there will be a new revelation of what incarnation means. There will be a new revelation of what Christ incarnate in all creation reveals. And with that in mind, I want to show what for me is a wonderful example of the changing attitudes to nature in Christian culture and the emergence of a new sign of hope through dialogue, through reclaiming the past in a way that reflects who we are today. So this is the Isenheim altarpiece, which dates from the early 16th century, 1512, just before the Reformation. In my view, it's one of the greatest ever works of Christian art. It was made for a hospice where the dying went to be cared for by the St. Antonite order of monks. So although actually this hospice was well enough known for its care that some rich people even wanted to go there, it was primarily a place where poor people who were dying or who were suffering from various bodily afflictions would go to be cared for. And this monumental altarpiece was created for the chapel in that hospice. This is the closed view. And of course, it would have been a very ornate structure, but this is what people would have seen on ordinary days. In the open view, the panels would have been opened up so that they would have seen this on feast days and other days. And when the panels were fully opened up, they showed this rather staid centerpiece, which I'm not going to talk about, but the two side panels were painted by Grunewald, Matthias Grunewald, who painted the whole altarpiece. It's an astonishing work of a medieval vision of creation, incarnation, rooted in human experience, scripture, and nature. So if we look at the crucifixion here, and I'm just focusing on little bits, I could talk all evening about the whole work. But if we just look at this crucifixion, what's going on here? And I want to suggest that we have a complete weaving together of the cosmic Christ. In the background, although it's only very hazy, it's dark. There is this total darkness over the face of the earth, but there is just the faintest suggestion of water, which hints at baptismal rebirth, which hints at hope. I hope you can still hear me. My do not disturb thing has just flashed on. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can hear
Yes,
you.
we can hear you. Thank you.
I was just worried my computer was just doing something silly. So if we look at the body of Christ, our vision is invited to flow through this crucified body, which acts almost as a medium between the symbolic and the experiential. So on the left side, we have the people at the foot of the cross. We have Mary collapsing into the arms of the beloved disciple. We have Mary of Magdala raising her arms to Christ, beseeching him. We have the body of Christ bearing the kind of marks and wounds that would have been reflected in the bodies of those suffering, dying people kneeling in front of him. So they would have been drawn into the body of Christ by this image. He bears our suffering, he bears our wounds, and they can see by looking at this what that means. And on the other side, we have the symbolic, the scriptural. We have John the Baptist in time out of time saying, "Behold the Lamb of God," and pointing. He holds the book, the scripture, and down by his feet is the Eucharist. There's the Lamb of God and the chalice. But look at the mirroring on either side. So when this was painted, Mary of Magdala would have been regarded as the redeemed prostitute. Now, I know that today feminist biblical scholars say, but she wasn't. But I've worked with women sex workers in an outreach project, and I don't want to be so hasty to tidy up Mary of Magdala. I don't think she was necessarily, as some would say, a patriarchal invention that wanted to denigrate women. I think there's great comfort for women sex workers, for women who have loved wrongly but too much, to see in Mary of Magdala, one of the chosen at the foot of the cross, this whole history of abused, violated and commodified female bodies. So I have no problem with seeing Mary of Magdala as the redeemed sinner here. At the foot of Christ's cross is Mary the Virgin Mother, and Mary of Magdala and all womanhood is represented there. But on the other side, where Mary of Magdala sits with her anointing cask, we see the Eucharist, the forgiveness of sins, the chalice. John the Baptist holds the book of scripture in his hand. We pass through that loincloth wrapped around Christ, the Word became flesh, to Mary, whose white robe mirrors the scripture, the loincloth, and the lamb, and the beloved disciple holds in his arms the one in whom the Word became flesh. Now, I could go on, but there's a symphony in this image that if we read it as it would have been read by medieval worshippers who were not literate, but who understood the power of symbols, the way today, if we go down a high street, we recognize the symbols for McDonald's, Coca-Cola, whatever it happens to be, they would have been able to look at a picture like this and read it as we would read the signs in a high street. So there's a symphony of redemption going on here, in which creation and the story of salvation, the crucifixion, scripture, and the human experience are all woven into the image. Now, this, as I say, was shortly before the Reformation. Here we have a work of art on the other side of the Reformation. This is the Wittenberg altarpiece, which was painted in 1540 by Lucas Cranach the Elder, commissioned by Martin Luther. After the Reformation, the iconoclasts stormed Wittenberg Cathedral and destroyed all the art, and Luther was quite horrified by this. He had never intended it to go so far. So he wanted art to be restored to the cathedral, and this is what he commissioned. But look at the difference here. The Eucharist here is the worthy men of the town, gathered around a table. The crucifixion is now the word preached. There is no nature in this image. There is Martin Luther in the place of John the Baptist in that earlier image, pointing to the body of Christ, and the congregation sitting passively in a building looking. So the word made flesh is here becoming word again, and I dare to suggest that we begin to see the makings of the disgraced creation. Now, of course, that didn't begin with the Reformation. It began with the abuses and corruptions of the medieval church. But we're passing through history very quickly in a way that suggests that in Western culture, there came a series of events, the late Middle Ages, the Reformation, the so-called Enlightenment, in which we became increasingly distanced from creation as the sacramental place of incarnation, and increasingly became focused on the abstraction of the building, the word preached, the disembodiment of creation, the disgracing of creation. And you can see, if we compare these two, I think, what I mean by that. The sort of incarnational significance of the Isenheim altarpiece and the far more logocentric image of that crucifixion in the Wittenberg altarpiece. And that just makes me, to conclude, want to remind us of these aspects of African theology: oral, written, and symbolic. Now, as we know, in much of Africa, theology has to be oral and symbolic because not everybody has the literacy needed to access the scriptural text. Dialogical, inclusive, community-driven, humane, just, and contextual and reconstructive. So to conclude, I want to show you these images from the Case Karma altarpiece. This is a huge embroidered tapestry that was made, sorry, I'm just going to get back to my notes just so that I can make sure I'm getting my facts right for this. It was inspired by a woman from Hamburg and the Cape who went to visit the Isenheim altarpiece and brought pictures back. And mainly the women, grandmothers and mothers involved in an AIDS project, said they wanted to make something like this. And that's how the Case Karma altarpiece came to be. It was created by 130 mainly women from the Eastern Cape. And it uses the symbolic significance of the Isenheim altarpiece, which, remember, was made for people suffering from a terrible medieval condition called ergotism, but people who were dying of diseases that they didn't know how to cure, basically. And what they did was to translate this into the vernacular of South Africa in the time of AIDS, and to use it as inspiration to create an African version. And here we see the symbolic, the oral, the enculturated images inspired by that medieval image, but actually translated into an idiom that makes sense for an African audience. And these glorious images of creation restored to the Christian vision, in the context of suffering, in the context of the challenge of what it means to be human, with all the light and shade of the human condition. And in the middle, we see photographs, mainly of grandmothers with AIDS orphans. And you can read, I've sent the link to the whole website that will tell you all about that in the presentation that I circulated. But I want to end with that. And I've done a picture to show you the scale of it so that you can see how big it is. I want to end with that because it brings together everything I'm trying to say about the loss of a sense of creation as sacramental. You know, without creation, there is no other sacrament. There is absolutely nothing without creation. And if we don't have a right relationship to creation, how can we have a right relationship to any other sacrament? For it's all about the material revelation of God in the matter that we are able to transform and render translucent to the grace of God through our sacramental and liturgical worship. So restored here out of suffering and silence is a reconnecting of a vision that in Western Christianity we lost, and in Western culture we lost. And I see this as a symbol of great hope for a new language that we Christians might begin to speak, drawing on the past, drawing on the best of our traditions, but responsive fully to the suffering of our age. And that's all I have to say. So I'm going to try and get out of this now so that I can come back to you.
You're fine. Keep your camera on if you don't mind, and also the audio. We really appreciate everything you said today. And I think that Prof. Terry Sacco may have something to say before she leaves. Because she has to take care of some big guests for the Hour Known
Sure.
situation. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my thoughts together. But one of the things that I noticed is the idea of Mother Earth. Okay? And by the way, Yako, if you don't mind, go ahead and sort out the round table. But with Mother Earth, all right, so you have God, Father, everything that goes with that. Then you have Mother creation, Mother Earth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There seems to be a disconnect between the two that is problematic. And you've highlighted that. And I'm curious about how you see that reconciling itself. Because Mother Earth is more or less a pagan understanding. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong. Pagan's not a bad word here. But there seems to be an idea of like Mother Earth and her creation and her this and raping her and et cetera, et cetera. And it only extends to Earth. It doesn't extend to the cosmos. So I'm curious about how you want to reconcile that problem, or at least address that problem. So
Thank
while
you.
Rocco and all the other roundtable people are working up their questions, if you don't mind, answer that question, please.
So if I may say thank you to Tina. It was an exquisite presentation, and what touched me deeply were two things. The focus on the women's experience and to really open spaces to be critical of Laudato Si and the beloved man that leads our church and that we revere, and to have the courage to actually say, but where are the women? That was deeply moving, because at the moment I'm teaching a master's program in education, and we're looking at decoloniality and the curriculum. And one of the students said he's deeply pained by the fact that a lot of the decoloniality discourse is not focusing on the experiences of women. Mm-hmm. So that really put a spotlight for me. And it will be very good for the students to hear just how important you've made that discourse and that you've made that experience. And the other thing is that in the decolonial discourse, they're talking about an epistemology that isn't dominated by rationality. Mm-hmm. And you've inspired me to invite students to look at how they can bring their oral histories in, to bring the stories of their experiences and the genealogy of where they come from, both intellectually and culturally. So it was a very rich experience for me, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So shall I come to Justin's question before we go to the round table? I hope I've left enough time for it, by the way. We started slightly late and I went on slightly long, but I'm okay.
A little African time. It's okay.
Good. I mean, my main specialism is, of course, Mariology. That's the lens through which I look through a lot of this stuff. And I didn't do it today because of, again, time. I went on too long anyway. But the way I reconcile all this is through Mary. You know, again, we've lost much of what Mary meant for the early church. She was called the rational paradise by patristic thinkers. And her body is seen as the new creation, the virgin earth out of which the second Adam came.
If I may stop, also, and this is a horrible thing, the second Eve.
Again, we need to do a long thing to do that. But that was not a dualism in the early church. It was a duality. Eve was almost like, imagine if Mary had said no, that would have happened. But Mary was known as Eve's advocate. So for me, in Eve, we see the real suffering of women. Your husband will lord it over you and you'll bear your children in pain. That is life as women know it.
Oh.
And in Mary, Eve has an advocate and she has an eschatological horizon. It was not intended to be like this, and it will not be like this. This is not God's will for you. So I want to read it against the grain without ditching the symbols. But if you take Mary as the personification of the church, and the church, again, in the early church was known as the new Eve, the church as the new creation sacramentally, then within the church, we should be encouraged to see creation through the eyes of the redeemed. And Augustine said, you can't have God for your father if you don't have the church for your mother. Now, so also our ecclesiology is diminished if we have a poor anthropology of maternal life. So it all knits together. And, you know, in all this, I have to say the context would have to be a theosis, the divinization of the human in Christ. None of it works if you have a hierarchy. But Christ undoes the hierarchy. We are Christ's brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
We are divinized in Christ. So it's not God the Father and the Mother in that kind of, it's.
Oh, I don't know if you know this, but the Baltimore Catechism, which is what is taught in America, tells you that Mary is the co-mediatrix, the one who unties the knot, if you will. And all that bonding in Christ is basically Mary. And Mary actually kind of becomes like the secret way in which you can actually absolve your sins. You pray to Mary, and then she tells Jesus, it's okay. That is literally how the Baltimore Catechism.
Well, as a convert from Presbyterianism, I had all this told to me. Catholic
You know it.
But it's, you know, there's a different way of reading it. I support the idea of co-mediatrix, but it's definitely not in the way the writers of the Baltimore Catechism would. But, you know, if you read St. Anselm's prayer to Mary, God is the father of all created things, and Mary is the mother of all recreated things. And that's Anselm, you know, we're not talking about Mary Daly here. We're talking about one of the most influential medieval theologians who says God is the father of all that is, and Mary is the mother of all that is good.
Yeah.
So that's a very different relationship.
Yeah. And it works on that way too. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Yaku Cougar. If you don't mind turning on your camera, Yaku.
Hi, Yaku.
And also
there we go.
To Cyril May and Jeze, or Benoit. Could you turn your cameras?
Yes, thank you very much. And also from my side, a preliminary thank you to Tina there for such a dazzling and enchanting presentation. There's such a depth in there. I really don't blame anyone for now really jumping into a conversation. Can you hear me? I seem to be having a little bit of a trouble with my connection, but could you hear me? Right. All right.
Yeah.
So as you know, and to all the friends also that's joined us from outside welcome again to all of you. This is also an occasion of a postgraduate symposium, so to speak, have every now and then at St. Augustine. And thank you really for, joining us. And Tina, as is also part of this postgraduate meeting. Therefore, I think we've asked two of our or three of our postgraduate students just to respond first and ask, jump in with a question. And I think after that, we'll open it up for discussion. So we've had a bit of trouble with one of our postgraduate students, Leanne Hunt. I couldn't see her in the meeting. Leanne, if you're here, perhaps under a different name on the screen, could you just give us an indication if you are here?
Yeah. Just to let you know. Sorry? Are you here, Leanne?
Thank you. Doesn't seem so. So she must have had some trouble joining. I'm sorry for that.
Yeah. If I don't, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we had three people for a roundtable, Leanne Hunt, but we have load shedding here, which basically means that power goes out, and it happens.
Yes.
But we do have two people who are here. Cyril May, he graduated from Bachelor of Theology at St. Augustine, and he's currently working on infill in theology in St. Augustine, of course. And outside of his regular hours, he undertakes social outreach work aimed primarily at orphaned and vulnerable children and other vulnerable and marginalized groups. Now, Jeze, or Benoit Mwambe, is a postgraduate theology student at St. Augustine's, and he is a Congolese priest. He's Fide Donum, which means that he's a special type of missionary priest, and he is now stationed in the Diocese of Port Elizabeth. So, Jeze, Cyril, if you could turn on your cameras, or at least turn on your microphones and introduce yourselves. I did a horrible job of it. I know I did. But I'm just reading from this thing, and I'm dyslexic, and I'm very tired. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Justin. I have a few problems with my video, so I've just turned my audio on.
All right, that's fair enough. But Jesse, if you can turn on your camera, if you don't mind, I'll turn off mine. And then I'll hand it off to Prof. Jaco Kruger. And Tina, if you don't know, I've talked to you about Prof. Jaco a little bit, but now he's our academic dean.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's more of a poison chalice than it is a laudatio.
Yes, I know.
All right. So, Jaco, you have the floor. Jesse, Cyril,
yep.
And if Leanne joins us, then that's fine. But you have the floor, Jaco, okay?
Great. Thanks, Justin, for all of that. And as I said, right, or started to say this, we conceive this as a roundtable discussion, but perhaps, it sort of just segues into a broader discussion from all of the participants. It's not really meant to exclude anyone here, but I would like, to ask Jeza and Cyril to sort of get the ball rolling with the conversation, in the light of your presentation. Actually, I think it was Cyril that had that wanted to make a comment about the church. And I know that we've just now, you've talked about the church and the ecclesiology. So I think maybe, Cyril, would you want to start with your comment regarding the church? And then after that, we'll have Jeze, and I know Jeze's comments have to do with, African understanding and so forth. So Cyril, would you like to jump in, please?
Yes, thanks, Professor Kruger. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, and thanks to Professor Beatie for an informative and also thought-provoking presentation. Just worth noting is that part of your presentation has given me some ideas to incorporate in my Christology assignment on German Moltmann's The Crucified God, a very interesting book.
Yes.
Before I pose my question, first I'd like to set the scene. Most churches seemingly show very little regard for environmental issues as a concern for serious thinking Christians. Environment is not found in most books about the Christian life or discipleship studies, and teachings about the environment are not a priority in sermons. Since Christ revealed what it looks like to live as a creature in alignment with God's purposes, Christology is important for creation. My view is that the place of redemption cannot be higher than that of creation. The two are equally important, and a relationship also exists between redemption and creation. And this leads to my question. Is the church part of the cause of the environmental problems we face, in that the church has a tendency to make creation secondary to redemption?
Thank you. Yes. And again, I think we need to understand this in the context of the development of Western culture from a patristic and early medieval church. Now, there are some who would argue that right from the beginning, and again, like Justin said, I use the word pagan not in any negative sense, but as, you know, the religions that were the nature religions and the religions that surrounded Christianity in the early days of its emergence. And there are some who would argue that because Christianity, when it became triumphant, attacked a lot of the natural shrines and places of the existing religions, it was anti nature from the beginning. But that's not true. I don't think that's been shown to be a fairly false hypothesis. I think it was Lynn, forgotten his name, but anyway, I think a more accurate reading is that as the late medieval world emerged and modernity, a culture of exploitation emerged and nature became disgraced. And I think that played out differently in the Catholic and the Protestant religions. But I think in both terms, there was a sense of a God who was no longer creator, but, you know, the focus on sin and redemption rather than creation and incarnation. So, yes, I think the church has played a huge part in shaping Western culture because of Lynn White, that's it, Lynn White, because of imperialism and now neo-imperialism, globalization. It continues to be true that Western attitudes inflict themselves upon nature and creation, but the church is part of that. And you're right, the church hasn't yet centralized the environment in the way it needs to. But I think the answer to that is not guilt and science. It is love and language. It is a celebration and affirmation of creation and a grief for the wounds and the vulnerability, but a grief that inspires us to act through tenderness and love for what is threatened. So yes, but the church definitely, and you know, we'd have to look at different denominations and the ways they play that out, but whichever church we look at, you know, whichever form of Christianity we look at, the problem of kind of either disgracing nature or rising above it. Natural law has been made very abstract. It was never understood that way in the early medieval church, you know, the way it is now as a kind of absolute dictate from God that we can't change. That's a weird way to read it.
Thank you, Professor Beatie.
Just real quickly, because this is a postgraduate seminar, I think this is very important. The history of theology and the history of the church unfold. So you can't think of like what Augustine said as equal to what Augustine would say in 2022. And it has to unfold, and you have to have that historical critical method. This is one thing that we've taught all of our classes, but that's something very important.
Yes, definitely. And that's why I use that case karma altarpiece and the Isenheim altarpiece, because it's a way of saying this is visually how we might read Augustine today, you know, the inspiration and the the essence, if you like, is still there, but it's interpreted in a way that makes it relevant for today.
Jaco, you can open up your. I know we lost contact with you, maybe because of load shedding. You can carry on with the.
Yes. Thanks, Justin. Right. No, I lost a little bit of the conversation there, but I also think I got the gist of what Cyril was asking. Cyril, did you want to make a follow-up comment with with regard to this at the moment?
Not at the moment, Prof. Kruger. My follow-up, my later question is looking at the implications for environmental theology. So I'll pose that question later.
Thanks for your question, Cyril. It's
Yes.
really important. I completely agree with what you're
Right.
implying.
In that case, if it's not, it's not a follow-up, then let's give Jeze Mulambwe an opportunity to respond or make a comment, please, Jeze.
Thank you, Prof, and especially I thank Prof Tina for your enlightening presentation. There's no comment I'll make on the question of Cyril. I have just one question here to ask you. It has to do with the struggles of rural African women. I'm also amazed to see the way you presented, express your concern regarding women in this. Now, my question is based on African art. What strategy or approach would you advise us as a student to help these women who are struggling, African women, rural African women? Here it's that they live already in harmony. According to them, to the framework, they understand that they are already in harmony with nature. They have their own special way of listening to nature. And they understand also that they depend on nature resources for their survival. Now, which strategy now can you advise us that we could use based on African art that could help these women to embrace Laudato Si's message?
Thank you. Well, perhaps they could help Pope Francis to understand more what he's talking about when he talks about nature and women. He needs to listen to these women as well. Because again, I think there would be a question for me about an understanding of nature, which for rural women is often their survival depends on it. As you know, that when you have to care for people, tend the sick, look after children in rural communities without many resources, you have to understand your natural environment. But at the same time, nature is not always romantic, as we know, and we need to face up to the fact that maternal mortality, childbirth is natural, but there are times when medicine and science and technology save our lives. And, we know that's true in many different contexts, from malaria to whatever, that I don't want to, again, sound romantic about the challenges we face. Nature also challenges us. But I think in terms of art, that's very interesting. I mean, the Case Karma project now continues to use great European works of art to inspire these women. And these are poor rural women who made that wonderful work of art. My own feeling is that music and folk art and things which in the West sometimes become passive performances. So we go to concerts, we go to operas, we go to art galleries. We're not always creators. We're often just passive audiences for these things in the West. And when I am in Africa, in the communities I know, I think there is still that immense communal creativity, particularly among women, the singing, the dancing, the making things. I think, that's already there. And that sense of attention, how do we attend to what these women create? What gives them joy? What allows them to express who they are? And how can we make that part of the dialogue? You don't have to write books. You don't have to be able to stand in a lecture room. How can we look at those women's art? How can we listen to their songs? How can we sit in their gatherings? Now, there's also, I think, an issue in this, which I find very interesting. I sometimes come against priests in this country who say, oh, you feminists, you're just white, discontented women. The women in the African churches are very happy. Now, I know, well, Nontando, if she's still here, will back me up on this. When African women are gathered together, if there's a male priest in the room, they're not likely to say what they might say if there were no men present. So you're not going to hear necessarily what they're saying unless there really is a space of, bye-bye, David Jackson, just a note popped up, unless there's really a space of attentive permission to speak without judgment. So I think there are lots of questions there, but I mean, maybe Nontando can add to this because she's more hands-on with this than I am. You're muted.
Nontando, please go ahead.
Yeah, make sure your mic's off.
No, okay. No, thank you very much, Tina, just for just giving us a whole buffet of knowledge. We're nibbling with so much to actually get into. I just just as a follow-up, the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians have just released 3 volumes of research on environmental issues and the impact on women. So women are speaking in spaces that they have created for themselves, not waiting until somebody says it's now time that you can speak, but saying we are just going to take that time, we are going to take knowledge, we are going to, root ourselves in the stories, in the day-to-day stories of women. And I think Terry mentioned the whole decolonial thinking that you start with the stories of reality.
Yeah.
Yes, and so I would say that through the circle bridging the gap between academia and the concrete lived experiences of women is able to create that space or to translate what women are saying at grassroots level to bring that across. And so I just wanted to comment that they have produced this material.
That's good to know. Yes. And I should have mentioned that because you did tell me actually about those books. It would be good to flag them up more, wouldn't it?
Speaking of flagging them up, Nontando, could you tell us what the circle is, just for people who don't know?
Yes, sure. The Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians is an organization of women theologians. It's both ecumenical and interfaith. And it was like an awakening. I think it started when African women started to notice the exclusion. They realized that even when African theology is being spoken about, that their voices and the things that concern African women, culture and some practices are not part of the discourse. They're not mentioned in issues. And it was that exclusion and that gender blindness of male theologians that led to African women theologians carving out a voice for themselves. And also even in relation to feminist theology, realizing that there is a unique experience there that is also unable to be captured within the broader feminist movement. So African women theologians themselves have various names for the theologies that they do, and some, give indigenous names to the, theologies, to try, like Mosadi theology, try to really to say, let's bring the voices of women. And they have done a lot of research during HIV and AIDS. They were responsible for bringing, bringing the stories of women out there, and they continue to do so. So that's the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians.
All right, if you could do me one last thing, and I'll let Yaku take over. Could you give us your URL or your web address, and also type it into the messages here, and then I'll hand it over to Yaku.
No problem at all. I'll do that.
All right, but what is your URL? What should we search for online?
The circle. What I'll do is that I'll find the actual web link and copy it and put it in the message.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yaku, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's all you, bit.
No, it's not a problem at all, Justin. I think we're just working together in all of this, and it is a round table after all. But Jeza, you asked the question, and I want to just give you the opportunity, if you want to follow up or respond, if there is anything that you want to add at this point, or perhaps you want to introduce a second point. We still have a couple of minutes. I think we're sort of up until 8 o'clock South African time. So we still have about 20 minutes. That will also have, give us opportunity for other people who want to make comments. But Jeze, anything else from your side? Maybe your second point, if you want.
Okay, thank you so much. Allow me first to ask Prof. Tina or Notan if they can continue to clarify a bit on this. The second point or aspect I would like to understand is, let me put it in this way. Prof, when you're talking, there's something you mentioned which was very interesting. You said that there's a need of both tradition and change, and this can help us to move toward liberation. Now, what I need to understand from you is the way of contributing to the liberation of these women who are struggling.
Mm-hmm.
Who are struggling now. How to contribute? Well, they have the tradition they stick to regarding their relationship with the nature already they have. On the other hand, we see that nature itself is also crying.
Mm-hmm.
Nature that is helping them to live is crying. Now, how to help them to use? Which strategy can we use to help those women who depend on that? In the meantime, who need also to consider that earth itself is crying, it needs healing, while themselves they need also liberation. How to contribute to their liberation?
Yeah. These are challenging questions. And again, Nontando and the Circle do wonderful work on this. So I feel Nontando is more qualified to speak on that than I am. But I think wherever we go, and I don't want to sound as if this is just an African problem, it's definitely not. But there are still patriarchal structures that disempower women and nature. And I'm afraid they are as much alive in the Catholic Church as they are anywhere else on earth because of our sacramental structure. As long as you say that the female body has no sacramental significance, how can you talk about Mother Earth as a sacrament if actually the only sacramental significance of the female body is that of exclusion? So I think there are huge issues that are to be addressed by all the church, but of course, particularly in an African context, we have to look at particular contexts. Nontando, again, I think you've done so much work with the others on this, liberating African women from their own oppression when nature itself is also suffering. I think that's the question, Jesse, if I got that summarized right.
Yes, you are right. Thank you.
Yeah, and also just to add to what you're saying, Tina, that some of the cultural practices, like for example, that don't allow women to inherit land or to own land, means that there's no owning of the source, the fundamentals. If you don't own the land, even if you work on it, it's disempowering for women. And so the owning of the land, and also the exploitation of the land, whether it's through mining or whether it's through the way in which the land is distributed, particularly rural women who depend on the basics like firewood and as well as water. And I think now with the whole renewable energy, it becomes an opportunity for women to intentionally to tap into that, as well as not only to be part of the whole solar green energy, but to economically be empowered in participating, because that's usually the case, that large commercial farming has taken over the subsistence farming of women, and if they don't own the land, then that empowerment. And we saw the example of Wangari, where she started with the women planting trees, being able to be economically independent, and that evolved to women recognizing that the reason they're poor is not so much culture, but it's the politics of corruption, and beginning to get more and more involved that way. So I hope it alludes to that.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Nantando.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes,
And
perhaps
Josie,
not
thank
only-
you so much for your questions. I really appreciate your insights, and yeah, it take a long time to do justice to the questions of yourself and Cyril, but glad to have Nantando here to help me out.
Yeah, and so many questions, so many threads, so little time, isn't it? Cyril, a final thought or a final point from your side before we open up, and I hand over to Justin again.
Some Wi-Fi instability.
Ah,
May I pose my next question?
yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. My first question focused on the church. I'd like us to turn our attention to Christian practice. So church Christian practice, and then my last question looks at the theological implications. So Christians critique the impact of globalization on the environment, but Christianity's historical contributions to processes of globalizations tend to be neglected or de-emphasized. The lifestyles of some, if not many Christians, their roles and influence in business decisions, their political views, and also contributions to government policy making are just some examples. My question is, are Christians hypocrites in the sense that they claim to be God's stewards, but are at the same time part and parcel of the destruction of creation?
Yes. Somebody once said Christians are hypocrites, and the answer is no, the church is full of hypocrites, and the answer is that's the best place for them. But we're all hypocrites, I think, in some ways. Well, maybe people here aren't, but I'm a hypocrite. Okay, I'm sitting here talking about things that I don't do. I think being aware of that, we have to be careful with our language. Again, it's about language, isn't it? And there's a difference between saying, I know there are things we should do, and I know I don't do them, but that doesn't stop them being things we should do, that we're all sinners. Also, that's why I emphasize the language of desire and joy and love, because really guilt, and again, I get this from psychoanalysis, guilt perpetuates wrongdoing. If I feel useless, worthless, sinned again, I don't have the self-respect and dignity I need to do better. If I can find the fragile joy in just a moment when I was a bit better than I might have been, that's something to kind of pull myself along by. But yes, it's not enough just to talk of individuals, because our political structures are upheld by the systems and institutions of Christianity. In the West, it's implicated through and through. But you know what I tend to think is that it's not about individualism, but I do think that there cannot be a Christian nation or a Christian, I don't know, I think Christianity is manifest in the cracks and the gaps. It's not about individualism, but it is about individuals, which is why I like the cult of the saints. It's about us being able to latch ourselves on to people who can inspire us to do better. Sorry, everything's buzzing at me. I don't know what's happening, but they've all stopped. It's about it is full of hypocrites, and I think we have to call out people who are just blatantly abusing the Gospels and denying. You know, I sometimes think if only everyone took seriously what Jesus really did say. If you've got two coats, you've got one coat too many, instead of what he never did say about homosexuality or anything like that. You know, people take so literally things that are not there and ignore stonking great things that are there. You know, we swallow camels and squeeze out gnats. But, you know, I always want to say to people, look, let's start with what Jesus really did say in the Gospels. So how about the rich man through the eye of the needle? How about giving your coat to the poor? Before we start to read obscure meanings from Leviticus about why people shouldn't do what they do sexually today. You know, it's complicated. It's complicated, but we ignore so much that's blatantly there. And we prop up the status quo by inflating what's obscurely hinted at. You know, Christianity makes its peace with the status quo, and the West shapes that. You know, one of the examples that I find most complicated and difficult is that there is outrage, probably in many South African churches as well, but certainly in Western churches, outrage about Uganda just introducing the death penalty for certain forms of homosexuality. That is outrageous. But the Ugandan martyrs were boys who 150 years ago, the Christian missionaries said it's better to die than to have sex with the king because that's homosexuality is wrong. And, you know, I think for the West to say, yes, but we've changed our minds, and to keep expecting those messages just to be what the whole world agrees with, it's very complicated. And I'm not in any way endorsing what's happening in Uganda around gay rights, but I am saying when the West expresses outrage, there is hypocrisy, huge hypocrisy there, you know, about what counts and what doesn't. So yes, I have no answer, but yes, the church is full of hypocrites, and I'm one.
Thanks, Tina. And at that point, I think I should hand over to Justin to just chair the rest of the meeting, Justin, and arrange the order. I see there's a hand raised.
Yeah, I see a hand raised. Well, Mr. Munga, ask your question, please. And
Yes,
also, if you don't mind, I know it sounds bad, but just turn off your hand raise.
I've turned it off now. I'm just wondering, in what way does the reconciliation happen between the dissonance, the cognitive dissonance that happens between wanting to make a shift, and this dissonance, I imagine that it happens whenever the information changes from what I have been accustomed to, and I'm speaking as a male within the Catholic Church that has for most of my life drunk into the chalice of male-dominated theology, right? And coming alive to new sensibilities, more feminine theology, even though I'm quite uncomfortable sometimes when the feminine theology is also being culturally appropriated by men who do not really embody it. So I'm trying to get into this space, and I'm facing this cognitive dissonance, which is very uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And thank you for your honesty. And I think that expression, we stand naked before the world, in different ways, we all suffer from cognitive dissonance at the moment. And I think one of the ways that we need to reconcile that, I love what Pope Francis says about the priority of time over space and the need for patience and discernment. I think being aware and acknowledging that cognitive dissonance is an important step along the way, and not tormenting ourselves with it is a way of allowing space for something to grow, creating again that kind of silence where we can sit with something without necessarily having a resolution, because a resolution will be quick if we rush to it. And we need to allow something new and challenging to really, I think there's no other way than through prayer and patience and openness to what's challenging us. And that's difficult, because we always want to draw back and stay in our security. And I think it's frightening to just stand in that place of not knowing. But I think it's all we can do, even as we hold on to the hope of this is not the way things need be. And it may go on, or we never reach in this life those goals of perfection we long for. We're always going to have inner contradictions and struggles, but somehow that's part of being human. And, I think one of the most important things we need to do with ourselves in this time is, and I'm not saying just excuse everything we do, but I think we are human. And to be human is to be weak and fallible and vulnerable. And I think we can ruin our relationship with each other and creation if we're harsh on ourselves, because I will judge my neighbor as I judge myself. I can love my neighbor as I love myself, but I will judge my neighbor as I judge myself. And so my neighbor is confused, and so am I.
Do you have a reply, Mr. Munga? Or,
I'm just wondering. Yeah, I'm wondering whether you have some practices, and because what happens with the cognitive dissonance, at least speaking for myself, is that almost very quickly I want to find some clever words, some clever formulations, or something new, some fantastic poetry or line of something, right? Theological, a beautiful theological phrase. I'm always looking for something clever. Do you have other things, other practices that are probably embodied or artistic, that are a bit different from just intellectual exploits?
Well, I would need a minute to think of a beautiful theological answer to that, because I don't like to give answers that aren't clever theology. I share the problem. I really don't, except I know in myself that there is a layer of agitation, and beneath that there is something dark and deep. And I sometimes manage to get down there, and that's a quiet, still place. And somehow I think it's accepting that it is okay to be distressed. It is okay to not know and to sit in that space of unknowing. But it's the curse of academia, isn't it? We do we do want to give the clever answers, and I share that. So I just say, in sharing that, you share something really important and vulnerable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may add, I always think about Job's friends who just sat with him with the dung heap in silence. And sometimes the most clever thing you can do is just be silent and listen. Or even if he's not saying anything, just be there. Presence, the cleverness will come. But speaking of cleverness, I have two final questions for you, Prof. Beatie, if you don't mind. Now, this is a postgraduate seminar. So most of our students are in the MPhil or in the master's dissertation area, right? They're writing 18,000 words or 30,000 word mini dissertations. Hopefully, if you guys love us and you enjoy this stuff, you'll go to the PhD. That's a different story. What advice would you give to an MPhil student? And remember that they are in the dissertation phase. So like just only a dissertation phase. What advice would you give to an MPhil student when it comes to either writing, conceiving, working on a project, whatever it may be? And remember, this is 18,000 words or 30,000 words, depending on the program. But just go, have fun with it.
Well, just for the background, I left school at 15. I was in Zambia, and it was very hard to go on to secondary and higher education during those years when I was 15. And so I became a typist, and I finally went to university as an undergraduate when I was 36, the same year that my youngest child started school. So I've been through this rather late in life. And I think, you know, your dissertation, I always say to my students, imagine you are sitting around a dinner table with all the interlocutors you have, all the people you're reading for your dissertation, and treat them with respect and try to understand what they're saying. And do what Thomas Aquinas did with the people he disagreed with. Present them in their best possible light, because then you show how clever you are, not by making them look stupid, but by making them look very clever. So write with respect for those you criticize, listen attentiveness again, and think deeply about where you would disagree and why, but always with a courtesy, and choose subjects that you love, not subjects that you think will make you look clever. And so, you know, I think that passion, Justin said to me at the beginning, bring the passion. Have a passion. What do you really care about? And then arguments matter, reason matters, feelings matter. But when students put in my in their coursework for me, I say, you're not at university to feel, you're at university to think, which goes against some of what I've been saying. But think, reason, you know, and never think that you can second guess a good mark by just telling the lecturer what you think they believe. You know, the most impressive students I find are those whom I might disagree with, but they have argued well. I hope that helps. And same with a PhD, choose something that you will still want to know more about when you've finished your PhD. And remember, all these are stepping stones. They're not your magnum opus. You're going to go on to do what you want to do, but go through the hoops that you have to go through to get a master's and then a PhD.
That's an amazing answer. So the second question, which is a final question, this is a thank you so much for your time and effort and everything else. It's a goodbye question, if you will, but I'll say goodbye afterward anyways, because it's what I do. But outside of The Good Priest, which is a book you've just written, what is the thing that you have been watching, listening to, experiencing that has really captured you in the past couple of months? Could be a film, TV show, artwork, book, poem, doesn't matter. What is the thing that's been really capturing your imagination at the moment?
Okay, I'm going to read you a poem that I found this morning when I was thinking about that Irenaeus, and that will be my farewell. If I can find the page I wrote it on, because it's very pertinent to what I've been saying tonight. And I have it here because I printed.
Oh, we have a little bit of serendipity. I didn't mean this to happen, but hey, here we go.
Here we are. Okay. This is by a Jamaican British poet called Kai Miller, and it's called Book of Genesis. And just to help with the interpretation, it's asking us to imagine if we could just focus on God saying, "Let there be," and it was so. Okay. Suppose there was a book full of only the word "let," from whose clipped sound all things begin, fir and firmament, feather, the first whale, and suppose we could scroll through its pages every day to find and pronounce a "let" meant only for us. We would stumble through the streets with open books, eyes crossed from too much reading. We would speak in auto-rhyme. The world would echo itself, and still we'd continue in rounds, saying "let" and "let" and "let," until even silent dreams had been allowed.
Well, damn, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. That's a perfect way to end this. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Thank you, Prof. Beatie. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you all so much for being here. I really value your presence. Thank you. Thank you. Cyril raised a hand. Did you?
No, that was by mistake. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Cyril and Josie, particularly for your questions, and Nontando for your wisdom. And that presenting a buffet where we can nibble. I'm going to remember that. Nontando has the wonderful turn of phrase. So often when she's speaking, I write it down. And Sanu, she has what you were talking about that we both want. Every time you open your mouth, pearls of wisdom fall from it.
Yeah. It is to stick to you. You're like, that word's going to stay with me for a while, and it just resonates. We really hope to work well with you in the future. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around. I understand we have some load shedding issues, which was one of the problems, the reason why we had certain people. But this will be uploaded on YouTube, and much obliged to you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Prof.
Farewell for now. Farewell.
You've been a blessing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone.